The Committee on Education and the Workforce will come to order. A quorum being present, the committee meets today to consider H.R. 3459. Given time constraints, I would ask that members insert any written statements into the record. I will hold the record open until the end of the day in order to accommodate those members who may not have prepared written statements. I now recognize myself for an opening statement, and I will make an administrative announcement. We have a hard stop no later than 12:45. If we have not completed business, then we will recess and come back. We have an issue to address in the Republican conference. We're apparently going to elect a speaker today. So hard stop, 12:45. That's the administrative announcement. All right, good morning. Today the committee will consider H.R. 3459, the Protecting Local Business Opportunity Act. The legislation rolls back a partisan decision by the National Labor Relations Board that will upend small businesses across the country. The White House recently hosted a summit on amplifying the voice of workers in our nation's workplaces. We noted it was an interesting idea for an administration that has been tone deaf to the challenges facing workers and their families. Anyone who has been listening knows the President's failed policies are wreaking havoc on the country. An anemic economy, sluggish job growth, higher health care costs, and stagnant wages are the price working families continue to pay for the administration's misguided priorities. The President has shown he would rather grow the size and power of the federal government than grow the economy and middle class. That's why so many families are struggling to make ends meet and are worried about the future. It's also why the bill before the committee is so important. The National Labor Relations Board has played a leading role in advancing the President's flawed top-down approach to the economy, and its effort to redefine what it means to be an employer is just the latest example. For more than 30 years, federal labor policy held that two or more employers were, quote, joint employers if they shared direct and immediate control over essential terms and conditions of employment, such as hiring, wages, and work schedules. This common-sense policy protected workers and allowed countless individuals, including women, minorities, and first-generation Americans, to realize the dream of owning a small business. Their small businesses are located in neighborhoods across the country, employing millions of workers and providing invaluable support to local communities. Now the NLRB is threatening everything these men and women work so hard to achieve. In its Browning-Ferris decision, the board vastly expanded joint employer liability to include those who have indirect control or even the potential to control employment conditions. The consequences of this will be far-reaching. Larger businesses will begin exerting greater control over small businesses. If they are legally liable for the decisions of their smaller partners, they will have no choice but to demand a greater role in how those small businesses operate. Or they might stop doing business with the local employers altogether. For many, the legal liability won't be worth the trouble of franchising a business or working with a local subcontractor. This is what we've learned in recent months from those directly affected by this unprecedented decision. They have shared how it will lead to higher costs for consumers and fewer jobs for workers, as well as threaten their livelihoods and the livelihoods of other small business owners. Ed Brady, who owns a Burger King restaurant in Baltimore, warned this decision, quote, will very likely cause me to go out of business. He went on to say, I became a franchisee so that I could run my own business and help those in my community. The new joint employer standard will not only destroy that dream, but the dreams of other young men and women who hope to create a better future for themselves. Close quote. I know there are some who would rather heed the advice of academics and so-called experts, but I think we should listen to Ed Brady and others like him because they are the ones who must face the costly consequences. And make no mistake, these men and women are urging us to stop the NLRB's attack on their businesses and pass the Protecting Local Business Opportunity Act. The bill simply says that a joint employer relationship exists only when multiple employers share actual, direct, and immediate control over employment decisions. This is the same standard that served workers and employers well for decades. If a franchisor or contractor has significant control over a small business, this bill allows the NLRB to hold them responsible. What the bill does not allow is for three partisan bureaucrats to disrupt the lives of countless small business owners and the millions of workers they employ. We have spent years trying a top-down approach to the economy, and it isn't working. Policies that place more faith and control in politicians and bureaucrats will not deliver the growth and prosperity our nation desperately needs. It's likely we will discuss a number of those policies today, including ideas that would allow Washington to micromanage work shifts or make it easier for trial lawyers to harass employers. These are just new twists on the same flawed approach that continues to fail working families. A better approach is getting Washington out of the way and letting small businesses do what they do best: create jobs and opportunity for workers and their families. Let's ensure policies are in place to protect workers, but do so in a way that allows America's job creators to succeed. That's why I urge my colleagues to help roll back the NLRB's misguided joint employer decision by supporting the Protecting Local Business Opportunity Act. With that, I now recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Scott, for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, the bill we're considering today would overturn the National Labor Relations Board's recent decision in the case known as Browning-Ferris. That provided that a more inclusive test in who is treated as a joint employer under the National Labor Relations Act. Under that act, two statutory employers may be joint employers if they share or co-determine matters governing the essential terms and conditions of employment. The board's recent decision simply overturned the traditional. The board's recent decision simply returned to the traditional joint employer test in place prior to 1984, a time when franchise business model had prospered. And so the NLRB decision certainly cannot be described as unprecedented, because there are decades of precedents under that law, and we should, in fact, Mr. Chairman, listen to experts. Today, the NLRB takes a reasoned case-by-case approach to assessing whether a franchisor or other employer is considered a joint employer. For example, the NLRB Council determined that Freshie, a franchisor with over 100 stores, would not be a joint employer because its control was generally limited to brand identity and product quality, and it had no right to control the terms and conditions of its franchisee employment relations. The bill before us, however, would have a far-reaching and perhaps unforeseen negative consequences for America's workers and employers. The bill jettisons the common law definition of employer and amends the definition of joint employer to only those who have, and I quote, actual, direct, and immediate control over the terms and conditions of employment. This bill denies workers the right to bring all of their employers to the bargaining table who have a say, whether exercised or not, in the essential terms and conditions of employment. Doesn't end there. I'm concerned that the bill would have an unforeseen consequence of emboldening franchisors to exercise more control over their franchisees than under current law. By abandoning the common law test for who is an employer, the franchisors or others could maximize their control over a franchisee's employment practices without incurring liability as a joint employer. Mr. Chairman, this bill should be rejected. By my count, this committee has met 23 times since 2011 in attempts to undermine the ability of workers to organize and collectively bargain. It is unfortunate that the majority is continuing in this path because, as a recent Education and Workforce Committee Democratic staff report shows, unionized workers earn higher wages and have access to better benefits than their non-unionized counterparts. Mr. Chairman, the majority of the gains of our economic recovery have been disproportionately concentrated among the wealthiest 1% and not benefited millions of hardworking Americans. This committee ought to be focused on policies that would help working people make a better life for themselves and their families. We know that workers all across America are struggling, and that it's been a very long time since most of them got a raise. So today, my colleagues will be offering amendments that would strengthen protections for workers, help provide for predictable schedules, prevent worker misclassification, and eliminate loopholes that employers use to justify paying men more than women. These solutions are part of the Working Families Agenda, an agenda supported by Democrats in this committee and across the Democratic caucus, and that includes policy solutions that would boost wages, help workers achieve a better balance between work and family life, and level the playing field by ending discrimination so all workers have a fair shot. All of these priorities are within our committee's jurisdiction, and I urge my colleagues to support these Democratic amendments. Mr. Chairman, we should be partnering to help all workers earn decent wages and receive fair benefits that enable them to provide a better and more prosperous future for their children. That's where the attention of this committee should be, not on repeated attempts to undermine those same workers' ability to organize and to collectively bargain. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The committee will now proceed to the consideration of the bill, H.R. 3459, for amendment. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point, and any amendment offered shall be considered as read. I will soon recognize Mr. Carter to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute. Without objection, the amendment shall be considered original text and open to amendment at any point. The amendment in the nature of a substitute has already been distributed and is in each of your folders. I now recognize Mr. Carter for 5 minutes to explain the substitute.
Thank you, Chairman Klein, and thank you for convening today's markup of H.R. 3459, the Protecting Local Business Opportunity Act. Before I explain the technical changes included in this substitute amendment, I'd like to discuss the importance of this issue more broadly. As a small business owner, I can attest to the many challenges that men and women across the country face in their efforts to establish and grow successful small businesses. In recent years, as our economy has struggled to recover, these individuals have had to work particularly hard to stay afloat and have sacrificed a lot to keep their doors open. It hasn't been easy, but as many of them will say, it's been worth it. They're proud of the opportunities they create for their employees and the services they provide to their communities. For them, owning a small business is about much more than generating an income or making a profit. As policymakers, we should do everything we can to encourage these hardworking men and women and to protect them from actions that threaten their livelihoods and the livelihoods of their employees. Unfortunately, the bureaucrats at the National Labor Relations Board are once again engaged in an effort that will deal a serious blow to small businesses. Expanding the joint employer standard not only threatens a small business owner's ability to run his or her own business, it also makes it harder for future entrepreneurs to do the same. Some have said that the board's decision has been blown out of proportion, but the small business owners we've heard from tell a different story. Just a few months ago, my colleagues, Dr. Rowe and Mr. Allen, joined me in Savannah to hear from some of our local small business owners who had serious concerns about what an expanded joint employer standard means for them. They discussed logistical challenges, legal confusion, and various economic hardships that could lead to lost jobs and store closures. Two small business owners we heard from, Cal Patel and Alex Algerio, are first-generation Americans. They explained how their families immigrated to the United States in pursuit of the dream of becoming small business owners. They are both very proud of what they have accomplished, as they should be. But they're also afraid that the NLRB's new joint employer standard will devastate their industries and their employees will suffer as a result. Another small business owner we spoke with, Fred Weir, said he believes an expanded joint employer standard has almost unlimited destructive capacity and will drain the life from the hundreds of thousands of small businesses like his. He's concerned that the new standard would not only undermine how he runs his business, but that it will also threaten the jobs of those in what he calls his employee family. These are just a few of the inspiring stories and a handful of the troubling concerns we've heard during the past several months. The Protecting Local Business Opportunity Act will provide certainty to these small business owners. It will allow them to continue making contributions to local economies, and it will enable others to someday do the same. We cannot allow a few bureaucrats at the NLRB to continue squeezing our nation's small businesses until they are forced to close their doors. We have a responsibility to act in the best interest of the American workers and job creators, and that's why passing this legislation is so important. The technical change in the proposed substitute amendment simply clarifies a reference to employer in the original legislative text. I urge my colleagues to support the substitute as well as the underlying bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Does any member seek recognition on the substitute? Mr. Hinojosa, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Klein and Ranking Member Scott, and my distinguished colleagues on this committee. I wish to express the focus of today's markup is a setback for America's workforce. I regret that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have once again chosen to use this committee's time to undermine the National Labor Relations Act rather than focus on expanding the rights and protections of hardworking men and women across our country who could use our help and protection against certain unscrupulous employers. It's worth noting that the majority has held many hearings or markups aimed at reversing the NLRB's decisions, policies, and procedures while ignoring key policies intended to improve workplace conditions and raise the standard of living for American workers. I'm afraid that H.R. 3459, Protecting Local Business Opportunity Act, will further exacerbate wage stagnation and income inequality by making collective bargaining a futile exercise where there is a joint employer who has the right to control the essential terms and conditions of employment. Unfortunately, this legislation gives employers who have the ability to control working conditions a route to evade collective bargaining responsibilities. Instead of eroding the NLRA, it is my belief that we should devote more of this committee's time to raising the federal minimum wage, to strengthening the middle class, preventing misclassification, and providing paid sick leave. We should be keeping American workers safe in their places of employment rather than undermining the equality of bargaining power between employers and their employees. With this in mind, I urge my colleagues on this committee to vote no on H.R. 3459 and support hardworking Americans in the workplace. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. Are there other members seeking recognition to speak on the substitute? Any members seeking recognition to speak on the substitute? Mr. Takano, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm opposed to this far-reaching bill that would undermine decades of common law regarding the definition of a joint employer under the National Labor Relations Act. I'm disappointed that we are yet again taking valuable time in this committee to undermine protection for workers. The bill before us is a blunt response to a nuanced issue, and as we've heard from witnesses last month, it could wind up harming the very same businesses the majority claims the bill aims to protect. Instead, this committee should be focusing on ways to help working families. No one working full-time in this nation should be living in poverty, and yet that is the case for far too many American families. And that is why House Democrats have been highlighting the working families agenda and calling on the majority to act on legislation that could make a real difference for families struggling to make ends meet. We should be focusing on efforts to raise wages, improve work-life balance, and eliminate discrimination in the workplace. The Working Families Agenda includes the Raise the Wage Act, which would increase the minimum wage to $15 an hour and abolish the tipped minimum wage. It also strengthens tools to improve the work-life balance by allowing workers to earn paid sick leave and paid leave to care for sick family members. Lastly, it fights against discrimination in the workplace, strengthening protections against gender-based pay discrimination, and making unmistakably clear that workplace discrimination against LGBT individuals is illegal. I urge the majority to stop these attacks on American workers and instead take up an agenda that will help working families, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Are there other members seeking recognition on the substitute? Ms. Adams, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am truly disappointed with the haste in which this committee has decided to mark up this piece of legislation. The Protecting Local Business Opportunity Act undermines employer accountability. It would discard longstanding common law used to define employers and employees since the Reagan administration. And as a new member of the committee, I would have appreciated an opportunity for the entire committee to be more engaged on this issue. And if the real goal is to help hardworking Americans, I would suggest that the committee instead focus on adopting federal workplace policies that protect our workforce. Because without basic protections like paid sick days, paid family leave, and flexible and predictable schedules, Many working parents are one illness or one accident also away from one paycheck, away from being destitute. And further, we have consistently failed to raise wages of our American workers, which is why we need to turn our attention to raising the minimum wage. That's why it's important that we support the Healthy Families Act, the Family and Medical Insurance Leave Act, the Schedules That Work Act, and the Strong Start for America's Children's Act. It's absolutely critical that we address the challenges that working families face here in America. We cannot continue to be a great country without the support of working families and the value that they add to our economy. Unfortunately, that has not been exhibited in the policies that we've passed here in the Congress. This bill further intensifies wage stagnation and income inequality by making collective bargaining an insufficient practice in the increasingly complex workplace, a clear slap in the face to many hardworking Americans. And if this issue were truly about helping our workers, I believe we would all be unified. But this is clearly not the case, considering Republicans failed to even hold a full committee hearing on the matter. I urge my colleagues to instead stand with our workforce and focus on legislation that benefit our hardworking families. I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
Gentlelady yields back. Are there other members seeking recognition? Mr. Polis, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll be brief. This is an important issue, and I think a lot of us eagerly await the findings of the National Labor Relations Board with regard to where we draw the line with regard to joint employers. I think the common law definition is workable, and I think the issue here is a very fundamental one. We want to make sure that that there is a negotiating unit there who can call the shots for employees to talk to, and it simply doesn't work for workers when you have an employer who points a finger in one direction and another to another employer who points the finger in the same direction. I mean, somebody sets the hours, the wages, the working conditions, and that entity is very reasonably an employer. And I think, as we've heard extensively in our testimony, it's consistent with the way nearly all franchises operate, that they are not, in fact, joint employers. Joint employers and having a franchisor that exerts that level of control is simply not what franchisors do. They want to free up their franchisees to make business decisions, to be individual business people. They don't tell them who to hire. They don't give them work schedules. They don't set wages. But if they do, and if there is some franchise operation out there where that occurs, then in fact they may very well fall under a reasonable definition of the joint employer rule. I also think this bill is premature. I think we should look at what the NLRB does, and again, I think there'll be some nuanced precedent. We already saw the Freezy case, which established that it was not in fact a joint employer, and we'll look forward to other pending cases being resolved in a thoughtful manner that I think will clearly demonstrate that this preemption bill and a change in the actual standard is simply not needed, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Are there other members seeking recognition? Other members seeking recognition? I think Mr. Allen was seeking recognition. You're recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I listen to these comments. Of course, I come from the small business community, and our business was the construction business, where we have a lot of agreements with subcontractors, and I have received lots of comments regarding this rule from our industry, and some of the things that my colleagues are bringing up here that they're talking about don't create jobs. Small business today creates about 70% of the new jobs in this country. And so what we're doing is we're allowing, the overreach of this administration to actually contribute to the decline of hiring of small businesses. In our hearing that Congressman Carter was talking about that we attended in Savannah, we actually heard testimony of a number of franchise organizations that felt like that they could no longer expand their businesses because of this rule. costing hundreds of jobs, not only in the 1st District of Georgia, but also the 12th District of Georgia, where, you know, hotelers, restaurants, and others depend on these subcontractors and these services, particularly the smaller businesses, the folks just getting started, to have the opportunity to grow their business. For example, in our industry, we have a number of subcontractors who actually are maybe just starting out and are needing you know, that project to actually build their business. And in this case, they're going to be told directly how they have to furnish their labor on that project. And I think that is going to contribute to a decline in the growth of small businesses. I think this rule is, you know, he said, well, it's going to be case by case. That's a problem, because then the federal government chooses who they're going to go after. And we know what that looks like. So I encourage my colleagues to vote for this bill. I think this bill will allow our small business community to understand that that Washington wants them to grow and hire more folks. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there other members seeking recognition? Mr. Grijalva.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And H.R. 3459 is pointless. It continues a very deliberate dismantling of the National Labor Relations Board and the work lives and the role that it plays in the work lives of the American workers. Instead of, you know, undercutting employee rights, maybe promoting sustainable wages and holding large employers accountable and bearing responsibility for their workforce, under this legislation, we're creating a protective shield for franchisors to assume more control over franchise labor relations without the liability concerns that come with that. Contract and outsourced employees, up to 5.7 million in this country, are now denied in this legislation basic employee rights due to the shell game of responsibility that can be played by joint employers, limiting employees and creating a perpetual limbo for these employees. The National Labor Relations Board and the joint employees decision began a very deliberate process of lifting workers from this limbo. And today we reverse that and create that and write into law the shell game where no one will have responsibilities. And at the end of the day, it's going to be the employer that bears all the responsibility and doesn't receive their fair rights and their ability to affect their job and their workplace. The real American family and worker agenda involves more than this. It involves some real basic issues that affect the workplace. It involves wage stagnation across this country. It involves the income inequality that we see growing and growing in this nation. It involves wage theft. It involves the wage disparity based on gender, race, and other discriminatory wage actions. It involves work schedules. It involves livable wages. It involves the right to collectively bargain and form employee associations. It involves paid sick leave, health benefits, child care provisions. It involves, quite frankly, the American worker being able to once again claim their place in the economy in this nation and not be pawns as it moves into more and more concentration of both power and wealth in a very tiny sliver of the richest of the rich in this country. A rigged system that concentrates that wealth to the richest of the rich at the expense of the workers is a losing proposition for this economy. The reaction by the American people to that is stark, and you can see it in this season as more and more people in a very populist mood are saying that's enough. There has to be a system in which the worker has a place in the economy and not merely a movable pawn in the economy. I think this legislation takes us not only back, but codifies into law a shell game at the expense of working people, hardworking people, and perpetuates the wage stagnation and perpetuates the inability of people to be able to organize and be treated with respect and some level of equality in the workplace. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I think Mr. Wilson was seeking recognition. Sir, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm grateful for the leadership of Chairman John Klein and Congressman Buddy Carter on this important issue. For years, the National Labor Relations Board has threatened to destroy jobs, invaded employee privacy, and encroached upon workers' rights. In a move that overturns 30 years of precedence, the NLRB has redefined the joint employer status, which, if not changed, will disrupt thousands of business operations, destroying jobs across our nation and across the state of South Carolina. In addition, this change threatens the dream of thousands of Americans who wish to own their own small business for their families, destroying more jobs. In addition to being a right-to-work state and having a world-class technical college system, South Carolina has a unique history of being a staunch defender of job creators and employee rights. We have had the success of Michelin of France. We have BMW of Germany, Bridgestone of Japan. We have Boeing. We have Volvo now coming to South Carolina. We have Continental Tire of Germany. South Carolina, because workers have the opportunity to choose where to work. South Carolina now is the leading exporter of cars of any state in the union, the leading manufacturer for the last 3 years of the production of tires and the export of tires. Extraordinary opportunities. But NLRB tried to stop this. When the NLRB filed a complaint against Boeing Corporation, Governor Nikki Haley, Attorney General Alan Wilson, Senator Lindsey Graham, and Senator Tim Scott led the defense of our workers against the Obama administration attack, and we were successful. Jobs were increased at the plant from 1,000 to over 8,000, with thousands of more jobs by subcontractors across the district I represent. We can show that the out-of-control NLRB can be stopped from destroying jobs. I'm grateful to be a co-sponsor of the Protecting Local Business Opportunity Act, and I urge its passage. I yield the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Bonamici, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to speak up on this bill and oppose it, but I want to bring perhaps a different perspective. Many years ago, before I joined this institution, I was in the private practice of law. And the clients I represented were primarily small business owners who were franchisees. And so I truly understand, probably not unlike the people you heard from my colleagues mention they had a hearing, heard from franchisees, and not unlike the woman who came to testify at our hearing from Nothing Bundt Cakes. The franchisee owner, the franchisees wanted a business that they could run on their own. They were excited. They were wanting to have that opportunity to create a business, to run a business. And in fact, that's what the franchise model does. That's what it continues to do. And in fact, the Browning-Ferris decision was not a franchise case. If we look at the Freshy opinion, that's where the NLRB determined that a franchisor is not a joint employer because its control is limited to maintaining the standards and quality. And that is truly how a franchise works. And the Nothing Bundt Cakes franchisee who was in our hearing said basically the same thing. She makes her own decisions about the day-to-day control of employment practices. So this legislation is not necessary. If you look at the Browning-Ferris case, it was a different situation. I'm concerned that the impact of the Browning-Ferris decision on franchisees has been exaggerated, and in fact, I'm concerned, as the witness, professor of law from West Virginia University testified in the hearing, that this actual legislation could embolden franchisors to take more control over the franchisees' labor relations without the fear of becoming a joint employer. So I'm concerned that the franchisees are going to see the franchisor become more involved when they, in fact, want to run their businesses themselves and just have the franchisor maintain brand standards and quality. So I'm opposed to the legislation. The common law definition of employer based on agency has been working. Let's look at this on a case-by-case basis, as the NLRB has been doing, and finding that a true franchisee model, if franchisor is not a joint employer, if the joint if the franchisor is coming in and monitoring and running the employment standards, then they should be a joint employer. So this legislation, I fear, Mr. Chairman and colleagues, will be counterproductive to the goal that we're seeking to allow these small business owners to run their businesses. So I oppose the legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady
Thank you, Mr.
yields
Chairman.
back. Are there other members seeking recognition? No one seeking recognition on the substitute. We will move to amendments. Who seeks recognition on amendments? Mr. Polis.
Have an amendment at the desk?
The clerk will distribute the amendment. Dr. Rowe?
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order on the amendment.
Gentleman reserves a point of order on the amendment. We'll wait just a minute as these get distributed. Make sure I know it. We ought to get a tram or something to help these. Okay, Mr. Polis is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The amendment in the nature of a substitute that I'm offering to strike today, all text after the enacting clause, and replace it with H.R. 3185, the Equality Act, a comprehensive civil rights bill that I proudly helped work on with lead sponsors David Cicilline in the House and Senator Jeff Merkley in the Senate earlier this year. Since the start of 114th Congress, we've seen this committee take up bill after bill that simply doesn't speak to the need of those most in need of our action. These bills continue to fail to address the actual needs of American workers and their families. We've seen legislation attacking employees' collective bargaining rights, legislation making it harder for employees to get access to the livable wages, fair working hours, equal pay and leave flexibility that workers need to provide for their families. None of these bills have addressed the core issues we should be focused on if our goal is to create and grow middle-class jobs. Today, my Democratic colleagues and I are putting forward several amendments to redirect our focus on this committee to the true priorities of the American workforce and to grow our economy. It should be our goal to make sure workers can achieve the American dream and protect their pay, safety, and of course to address the subject of my amendment. My amendment addresses a pervasive problem in the American workforce that makes it harder for hundreds of thousands of Americans' families to live their lives. That is discrimination against lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender Americans. Now, it might be tempting to consider the issue of LGBT rights settled after the Supreme Court's historic ruling on marriage equality earlier this year, and while that was an incredible victory for anyone in this country who values equality and individual freedom, marriage equality and full federal equality are two very different things. Marriage equality doesn't mean that a gay employee can still be fired from her job when her boss finds out that she got married, or that a transgender child can still be thrown out of his house when he comes out to his parents. It doesn't mean that families can still be discriminated against when they try to get a loan or move into a new house, or that LGBT students face bullying and harassment by their teachers and peers. The Equality Act would amend long-standing existing civil rights law to provide comprehensive protections against discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. It prohibits discrimination in employment, education, housing, credit, federal funding, jury service, and public accommodation. Our constituents overwhelmingly believe that discrimination against LGBT Americans is wrong. In fact, recent polls show that more than 3/4 of Americans oppose workplace discrimination. I think that I'm sure most of us would fully support the very simple reforms in the Equality Act because it's consistent with what our constituents are telling us across the political spectrum. In fact, 2/3 of Republican voters, in addition to over 90% of Democratic voters, believe in federal protections against discrimination. Unfortunately, our laws have not caught up with our values. It is still legal in 31 states to fire an employee simply because they're gay or transgender. In 28 states, same-sex couples have no legal recourse if their landlord decides to evict them from their home just because they're gay. And only 14 states prohibit discrimination against LGBT students in school. This is not a theoretical concern. It causes real harm, real hardship, reduces the efficiency of our economy and productivity, every day. Let's stop the partisan attacks on American workers and instead turn our attention to an issue that we should all be able to agree on, enabling all Americans to pursue their American dream, free from discrimination and harassment, creating more of a meritocracy, creating more efficiency in the market, and making sure that people can rise to the station that they're qualified to fill rather than be judged over an attribute that they don't have any control over. We can start doing this by sending the Equality Act to the floor for a vote, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Dr. Rowe. The gentleman makes a point of order. The chair is prepared to rule. Germaneness is construed narrowly in order to support informed consideration of legislation. On this basis, the chair finds the amendment is beyond the bill's scope, which narrowly addresses the definition of joint employer within the definition of employer under the NLRA. The amendment is a proposition on a subject different from that under consideration with the meaning of Clause 7 of Rule 16 of the House Rules. Therefore, the amendment is not germane. The point of order is sustained. The amendment is not in order.
Mr. Chairman, I challenge the ruling of the chair. This is a good amendment and ought to be considered.
Mr. Chairman,
Rowe.
I move to table the appeal.
The vote occurs on the motion to table. All those in favor of the motion to table the gentleman's appeal say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion to table is agreed to. Are there other amendments? Yes, Mr. McCann.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will distribute the amendment. Dr. Rowe.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order on the amendment.
The gentleman reserves a point of order. Okay, we now have the amendment in hand. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment I'm offering today strikes all the text after the enacting clause of H.R. 3459 and replaces it with the text of H.R. 3514, the Workplace Action for a Growing Economy Act, also known as the Wage Act. Mr. Chairman, H.R. 3459 undermines an explicit goal of the National Labor Relations Act to protect workers' fundamental right to collectively bargain with their employees. Instead of voting this damaging legislation out of committee, my amendment would turn this committee's attention to a very real struggle that workers face when they come together to bargain for a better deal. The Workplace Action for a Growing Economy Act would strengthen workers' ability to collectively bargain for higher wages and better working conditions. Restoring workers' ability to form a union is critical to raising wages since, on the average, unionized workers earn $207 more a week than their non-union counterparts. These are hardworking American families in my district and every one of your districts that continue to work harder and harder but are struggling to make ends meet. These hardworking Americans deserve a raise. The Raise the Wage Act would boost the wages of 30 million Americans by raising the federal wage floor to $12 per hour by the year 2020. One of the biggest factors suppressing wage growth for workers over the last 4 decades has been the decline in union density. From the late 1940s through the early 70s, workers' wages and productivity grew at nearly equal rates, and the number of workers who belonged to a union hovered around 30%. But in the decades that followed, private sector union membership declined dramatically, from 34 to 8% for men and 16 to 6% for women between 1973 and 2007. And despite rising productivity, wages for typical American workers barely grew. It's obvious that one of the clearest steps we can do to expand the middle class is to restore workers' ability to bargain for their fair share. And all too often, employer interference stops a campaign for a union dead in its tracks. 47% of employers threaten wage cuts if employees form a union. 57% threaten to close the facility, and 34% fire at least one employee in retaliation for organizing. And earlier this week, as part of the National Work and Family Month, I joined my Democratic colleagues in highlighting the need to support legislation for hardworking families, a working families agenda. Mr. Chairman, this committee should turn its attention to legislation that would boost the wages of these working families instead of considering legislation that would undermine bargaining protections under the National Labor Relations Act. Mr. Chairman, we should be supporting a full suite of bills that would boost wages by helping raise the minimum wage and the Workplace Action for a Growing Economy Act, which makes it possible for workers to bargain for a fair deal without being retaliated against. The National Labor Relations Act, which is supposed to protect workers who try to organize and form a union, has minimal penalties that do little to deter employers from breaking the law. And today, too many employers are exploiting the loopholes in the NLRA to prevent workers from negotiating for a better deal at work. Unlike the bill before us that weakens the NLRA, my amendment in the Wage Act would strengthen protections for workers and better protect workers' fundamental right to join together with their coworkers to get a fair shake. In particular, the legislation would triple the back pay for workers who are fired or retaliated against by their employers, regardless of immigration status. It would provide workers with a private right of action to bring suit to recover monetary damages and attorney's fees in federal district court, just as they can under civil rights laws. It provides for federal court injunctions to immediately return fired workers to their jobs, and it ensures employers will be jointly responsible for violations affecting workers supplied by another employer. This legislation would ensure that workers know their rights in the workplace by requiring employers to inform workers of their rights under the NLRA by posting a notice developed by the NLRB and informing workers of their rights at the time of hiring. I would urge my colleagues to support this amendment to this bill. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Dr. Rowe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I make a point of order that the amendment violates Clause 7 of House Rule 16.
The gentleman makes his point of order. The chair is prepared to rule. Germaneness is construed narrowly in order to support informed consideration of legislation. On this basis, the chair finds the amendment is beyond the bill's scope, which narrowly addresses the definition of joint employer within the definition of employer under the NLRA. The amendment is a proposition on a subject different from that under consideration with the meaning of Clause 7 of Rule 16 of the House Rules. Therefore, the amendment is not germane. The point of order is sustained. The amendment is not in order.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Scott.
Chairman, insofar as this amendment will actually enhance workers' rights to organize and bargain on their behalf, it is certainly consistent and relevant to the work of the National Labor Relations Board, and I would therefore challenge the ruling of the chair.
Gentleman challenges the ruling. Dr. Rowe.
Mr. Chairman, I move to table the appeal.
The vote occurs on the motion to table. All those in favor of the motion to table the gentleman's appeal say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion to table is agreed to. Are other members with amendments? Ms. Wilson, do you have an amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Thank you. The clerk will distribute the amendment. Dr. Rowe.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order on the amendment.
Gentleman reserves a point of order. We seem to have the amendment in hand, so the gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes to explain her amendment.
Mr. Chairman, the amendment I'm offering today strikes all text after the enacting clause of H.R. 3459 and replaces it with the text of H.R. 3427, the Payroll Fraud Prevention Act of 2015. My bill to amend the Fair Labor Standards Act to require that employers accurately classify their workers and provide employees with notice of that classification. The underlying bill, H.R. 3059, attempts to narrow the definition of a joint employer. This legislation is part of the alarming workplace trend of employers using unscrupulous practices to shrink responsibilities owed to their employees and deny workers a slew of federally guaranteed rights and benefits. Employers who misclassify their workers can use one of these unscrupulous practices by ignoring any current or proposed definition of employee, thereby stripping workers of their rights. I represent one of the most economically depressed districts in the country. So believe me when I tell you that it is disgraceful to attempt to strip millions of hardworking Americans of their existing labor rights, many of which are in dire need of an update. To strip workers of their employee status and thus their right to the minimum wage at a time when so many Americans can barely survive on $7.25 an hour is deplorable. To strip workers of their access to unpaid family and medical leave at a time when so few working Americans can afford to take unpaid time off to care for a loved one is unconscionable. To take any step towards upending the employer-employee relationship should be the last thing on this committee's agenda. Yesterday, during the Working Families Day of Action, I heard the story of Marvin, a bricklayer, who wanted nothing more than to work hard to become a productive member of America's working class, a group that for some inescapable reason is not given the respect it deserves. Marvin's employer forced him to take cash payments and use questionable safety practices. When Marvin spoke up about safety concerns at his job site, his employer refused to take responsibility for his workers. Instead, the employer said Marvin and his co-workers were subcontractors, and then he fired him. These unscrupulous practices abdicate employers' responsibilities, depress wages, endanger worker safety, and generally leave workers worse off. That's why workers must have the ability to organize and bargain for better conditions. But as you know, independent contractors are not covered in the NLRA, making worker misclassification another tool to stifle a worker's voice. When we look at these things together, it becomes clear that the attacks against working Americans are real, and we must act now to protect them. We should work to pass my amendment, the Payroll Fraud Prevention Act. Even if we win the battles to raise the minimum wage, strengthen unions, and secure more family-friendly policies, it means nothing if employers can simply strip workers of their rights with a simple 1099 tax form. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. Dr. Rowe.
Mr. Chairman, I make a point of order that the amendment violates Clause 7 of House Rule 16.
Gentleman makes a point of order, and the chair is prepared to rule. Germaneness is construed narrowly in order to support the informed consideration of legislation. On this basis, the chair finds the amendment is beyond the bill's scope, way beyond the bill's scope, which narrowly addresses the definition of joint employer within the definition of employer under the National Labor Relations Act. The amendment is a proposition on a subject different from that under consideration within the meaning of Clause 7 of Rule 16 of the House Rules. Therefore, the amendment is not germane. The point of order is sustained. The amendment is not in order.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Scott.
Mr. Chairman, insofar as this amendment would prevent the misclassification of employees, which has the effect of stripping them from all of their rights under the National Labor Relations Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act, it is a more important issue in labor relations, employer relations than the underlying bill. I would certainly hope that we would have an opportunity to vote on it, and I therefore challenge the ruling of the chair.
Gentleman challenges the ruling of the chair. Dr. Rowe.
Mr. Chairman, I move to table the appeal.
The vote occurs on the motion to table. All those in favor of the motion to table the gentleman's appeal, say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion to table is agreed to. Who has an amendment? Ms. Bonamici.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the
Clerk
desk.
will distribute the amendment.
I know the amendment is lengthy, Mr. Chairman. I'm thinking about planting some trees or something to make up for it.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5. Oh, Dr. Rowe.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order on the amendment.
Gentleman reserves a point of order. The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes to explain her amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The amendment in the nature of a substitute that I'm offering today strikes the text after the enacting clause of H.R. 3459 and replaces it with H.R. 3071, the Schedules That Work Act, a bill that's sponsored by my colleague from Connecticut, Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro, and which I am co-sponsoring along with many members of this committee and many other members. Today, this committee is considering H.R. 3459, an unnecessary bill that undermines employer accountability. Instead of taking away the ability of workers to advocate for better wages and working conditions, this committee should be focused on addressing the real problems facing workers all across America. Yesterday, I joined members of this committee and many of our Democratic colleagues in calling on Congress to work on the Working Families Agenda, which includes responsible solutions that hardworking Americans want and need. Solutions that would boost wages, help workers achieve a better balance between work and family life, and level the playing field by ending discrimination. Without basic protections like paid sick days, which I'm proud to say my state legislature in Oregon just passed, paid family leave, and flexible and predictable schedules, many working parents are one illness or accident away from losing their jobs. My home state of Oregon, as I mentioned, is one of the few states that now guarantees workers access to earn paid sick days. Almost 500,000 workers will benefit from this new law in Oregon, making my state a better place for families to live and work. Mr. Chairman, this amendment aims to help workers as they try to balance work and family obligations. Today, in more than 60% of households with children, all adults are working. But the United States has failed to adopt federal workforce policies that reflect this reality. Workers need to be able to better balance work and family life. This is good for workers and it's good for business. Workers need predictability, but too often hourly workers get their schedules only a day or two before they must report to work. For some, the number of hours they're scheduled to work varies greatly from week to week. Some workers are called into work only to be sent back home without being paid for the hours in their shift, simply because work is slow. These schedules make it impossible for workers to plan their lives, to arrange for child care or elder care, or get to their second job that they need to make ends meet, or to go to school to try to advance in the workplace. And when people don't know how much or when they will work from one day to the next, they never know whether they'll be able to pay for child care or even pay their rent. No one should have to live this way. I propose that the committee adopt my amendment to substitute the underlying text with the Schedules That Work Act. This act will protect employees from retaliation for requesting a more flexible, predictable, or stable schedule. For employees in the restaurant, retail, and cleaning occupations where unreasonable scheduling practices are especially well documented, employers must provide schedules 2 weeks in advance. This legislation offsets the difficulty of last-minute changes to the schedule. If an employee is sent home early from work without being paid for the hours in the scheduled shift, the legislation requires a minimum of 4 hours of pay or the amount of hours in the employee's shift, whichever is less. And finally, I want to point out that there are plenty of software choices that make predictable scheduling easy for employers to implement. This flexible and predictable schedule policy, along with paid sick days and paid family and medical leave, reflect real family values that will lead to healthier, happier workers in communities and a more productive workforce. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. Dr. Rowe.
Mr. Chairman, I make a point of order that the amendment violates Clause 7 of House Rule 16.
The gentleman makes a point of order. The chair is prepared to rule. Germaneness is construed narrowly in order to support informed consideration of legislation. On this basis, the chair finds the amendment is beyond the bill's scope, which narrowly addresses the definition of joint employer within the definition of employer under the National Labor Relations Act. The amendment is a proposition on a subject different from that under consideration within the meaning of Clause 7 of Rule 16 of the House Rules. Therefore, the amendment is not germane. The point of order is sustained. The amendment is not in order.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Scott.
Mr. Chairman, if the underlying bill passes, workers could lose their rights to negotiate better schedules, and since this amendment preserves those rights, it's certainly germane to the bill and ought to be considered, and I therefore challenge the ruling of the chair.
The gentleman appeals the ruling of the chair. Dr. Rowe.
Mr. Chairman, I move to table the appeal.
The vote occurs on the motion to table. All those in favor of the motion to table the gentleman's appeal say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion to table is agreed to. For the members who have amendments, Ms. Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will distribute the amendment.
Mr. Chairman,
Dr. Rowe,
I reserve a point of order on the amendment.
gentleman reserves a point of order. We seem to have the amendment, so the gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes to explain her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The amendment in the nature of a substitute I am offering today strikes the text after the enacting clause of H.R. 3459 and replaces it with the text of H.R. 1619, the Paycheck Fairness Act. Mr. Chairman, the bill before this committee today simply makes life more difficult for workers who are trying to exercise their rights to bargain with their employers. It could deny them the opportunity, their right, to bring all employers to the bargaining table. Instead of unbalancing the employee-employer relationship, we should be helping to level the playing field for workers who just want a fair shot. That is why the Democrats on this committee introduced the Working Families Agenda this week to encourage Congress and this committee to get to work on the solutions that hardworking Americans want and need. Solutions that would boost wages, help workers achieve a better balance between work and family life, and end discrimination. The amendment that you have before you would do just that. This amendment, in the nature of a substitute, would replace the underlying text and insert the text of the Paycheck Fairness Act. It is astonishing that in 2015, women still do not earn equal pay for equal work. The gender gap in America adds up to about $11,000 a year. $11,000 could mean being able to pay for childcare, afford groceries, or make the rent. It could allow a family to help with college tuition or help care for aging parents. And these lost earnings really add up. Over the course of a woman's lifetime, the wage gap adds up to about $400,000. The wage gap for women overall stands at 79 cents for every dollar paid to a white, non-Hispanic man, and it has barely budged in over a decade. And for women of color, it's much worse. For African American women, the wage gap is 62 cents, and for Latinas, it's 54 cents. The Paycheck Fairness Act would address this gap by giving workers the tools they need to fight back against pay discrimination. It would protect workers against retaliation for discussing their pay and require employers to prove that pay disparities exist for legitimate job-related reasons, and would improve remedies for pay discrimination claims under the Equal Pay Act. President Kennedy signed the Equal Pay Act into law in 1963, and for 52 years, American women have been waiting for equal pay for equal work. The time for waiting is over. It is time we act to close this gap and pay women the wages they have earned. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment and vote down the underlying legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Dr. Rowe.
Mr. Chairman, I make a point of order that the amendment violates Clause 7 of House Rule 16.
The gentleman makes a point of order. The chair is prepared to rule. Germaneness is construed narrowly in order to support informed consideration of legislation. On this basis, the chair finds the amendment is beyond the bill's scope, which narrowly addresses the definition of joint employer within the definition of employer under the National Labor Relations Act. The amendment is a proposition on a subject different from that under consideration within the meaning of Clause 7 of Rule 16 of the House Rules. Therefore, the amendment is not germane. The point of order is sustained. The amendment is not in order.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Scott.
Mr. Chairman, the underlying bill has the effect of denying workers the right to bargain with actual employees. They could lose the right to bargain for gender fairness if the bill passes, and therefore this amendment might be the last opportunity that workers would have to negotiate fair wages for women. And since the bill has that effect, it is certainly germane, and so I would appeal the ruling of the chair.
Gentleman appeals the ruling of the chair. Dr. Rowe.
Mr. Chairman, I move to table the appeal.
The vote occurs on the motion to table. All those in favor of the motion to table the gentleman's appeal say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion to table is agreed to. Okay. Well, we move through several pages here, ladies and gentlemen. You'll be pleased to hear. The question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed, no.
No.
The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. If there are no other members wishing to speak
Mr.
on the
Chairman.
bill, I will now entertain a motion to report the bill.
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, the NLRB decision is not unprecedented or extreme. It is actually a return to the law as it was in effect for decades, and as we heard at our hearing, is certainly consistent with the restatement of the law about who an employer is. It is my hope, Mr. Chairman, that our next hearing and markup will not involve another attack on the NLRB, but instead focus on helping working people make ends meet by taking up legislation that would boost workers' wages, help achieve a better chance to have a balance between work and family life, and level the playing field by strengthening protections against discrimination so that all workers can get a fair shot. Improving the lives of working families is what our committee focus should be in the remaining days of this calendar year, and I hope we can work together towards that goal. Mr. Chairman, I'd ask unanimous consent that 3 letters of opposition to the bill, one from the Teamsters, one from the AFL-CIO, and one from the Steelworkers, be entered into the record in opposition to the bill.
The union letters, without objection, will be entered.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Dr. Rowe.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the Committee on Education and the Workforce report the bill H.R. 3459 to the House of Representatives with an amendment and with the recommendation that the amendment be agreed to and that the bill, as amended, do pass.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no.
No.
The ayes appear to have it.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Scott.
ask for a recorded vote.
Gentlemen, request a recorded vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Klein?
Aye.
Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Wilson?
Aye.
Mr. Wilson votes aye. Mrs. Fox? Mr. Hunter? Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Salmon? Mr. Salmon votes aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Rokita? Mr. Rokita votes aye. Mr. Barletta? Mr. Heck? Mr. Messer? Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Bratt? Mr. Bratt votes aye. Mr. Carter? Mr. Carter votes aye. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop votes aye. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Mr. Russell? Mr. Russell votes aye. Mr. Corbello? Mr. Corbello votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Scott?
No.
Mr. Scott votes no. Mr. Hinojosa? Mr. Hinojosa votes no. Mrs. Davis? Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Fudge? Ms. Fudge votes no. Mr. Polis? Mr. Polis votes no. Mr. Sablan? Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Bocan? Mr. Bocan votes no. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes no. Mr. Jeffries? Ms. Clark? Ms. Clark votes no. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes no. Mr. Desagne? Mr. Desagne votes no.
How's Mr. Hunter recorded?
Mr. Hunter is not recorded. Mr. Hunter votes aye.
Could I ask the clerk to call the names of those members who have not yet been recorded on both sides, please?
Mrs. Fox? Aye. Mrs. Fox votes aye. Mr. Barletta? Mr. Heck? Mr. Messer? Mrs. Davis? Mr. Sablon? Mr. Jeffries?
Mr. Chairman, I understand that at least 2 members on this side are on the way. Could we recall those that have not voted?
The answer is yes, we can. I'm going to wait a minute or two for some more to get in the door, and we'll do that.
Thank you.
Okay, I see members arriving. Could we do that again, then? The clerk, please call the names of those members who are not yet recorded.
Mr. Barletta? Mr. Heck? Mr. Heck votes aye. Mr. Messer? Aye. Mr. Messer votes aye. Mrs. Davis? No. Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Mr. Jeffries?
It appears all members have voted. The clerk will report the total.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 21 yeas and 15 nays.
The ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. H.R. 3459 is ordered, reported to the House of Representatives. The chair notes for the record that a quorum is present. I now recognize Dr. Rowe.
Thank you, Chairman. I ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make necessary and technical changes to the bill, and pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L, I give notice that all members have the requisite number of days to file additional or minority views.
Without objection so ordered, the committee stands adjourned.